Welcome back to the Dear Katie podcast. This is Katie Koestner. I am the primary host of the Dear Katie podcast, and we are so delighted to have you take this journey with us on our weekly podcast episodes. I just want to remind everyone to do great self-care. Thriving is part of the purpose of this podcast, and we definitely want you to take a break at any time. Warm bath, fresh air, walk a dog, have a bite of chocolate, whatever you need to do good care for yourself. Just as a reintroduction, if you're not familiar with me, I am the woman who was on the cover of Time magazine at age 18 as the first in history to speak out nationally and publicly as the victim of date rape. And HBO made a film about me, and I went on to become the executive director of the Take Back the Night Foundation. We are the oldest, largest global movement on sexual violence in all forms for all people in the world. So we encourage you to visit our website for lots more information. So I'm going to turn it over to our hosts and our guests for today. Hi, everybody. We are so delighted for our episode today. We have a special guest, Renee Williams. This is Katie Koestner, and my co-host today is Emily Wang. Emily, you want to say a quick hello?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm so happy to be here and very excited to have our guest, Renee, here with us today.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, Renee is extremely talented, certainly dedicated to this cause and activism around sexual violence and supporting survivors, and has risen to a national leadership position. So, Renee, I always let our guests kind of introduce themselves the way they'd like to be known. So tell our listeners who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name, again, is Renee Williams, and I'm the executive director of the National Center for Victims of Crime. And in my spare time, I have a terrible work-life balance, but in my spare time, I like to come home to my farm, which has become a menagerie of rescue animals, and spend time with them because it really helps give me a nice break away from the office.
Oh my goodness, that sounds lovely. I love rescue animals. You're taking a work-life balance. Sounds pretty good, though, if you can care for some animals.
It does. I've got 2 horses, 4 sheep, 2 goats, 2 cats, and a dog.
Oh my God.
Sounds so fun. My goodness, I don't know which one I would go visit first when I got home.
I will tell you the goats are awfully cute.
Oh, okay. Well, and I assume they're not making goat cheese for you.
There's not one functional animal on this farm. They are all purely pets.
And then it sounds like they're probably purely happy too.
Yes, indeed.
All right. Well, your current organization is so very important. I know you haven't been there very, very long, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about your lawyer self, how you became one, where you went, and then how you come to your national position at this point.
Absolutely. So I was actually a theater major in undergrad. My degree says theater arts, and my specialty was acting. But I loved theater. I loved the craft of it, but I realized it was not for me. And so I immediately went to law school, and I went to law school with the idea of being a child abuse prosecutor. There was a lot of abuse in my not immediate family, but in my extended family. And I really saw the effect that abuse and violence had on future generations and on the psyche of individuals. And so I wanted to be a child abuse prosecutor. But while I was in law school, I heard that those folks burned out very quickly because it's a very hard job. And somewhere along the way, I got a little bit lost and I became a corporate lawyer. And I was a corporate lawyer for about 5 or 6 years when I thought, I'm good at my job. It's a comfortable life, but I am not doing what I set out to do, and I'm not using my talents to the best of my ability. So I got some classes in leadership at a local university, at Carnegie Mellon University, and decided to then move into the nonprofit space. And my first job was running a legal aid organization outside of Pittsburgh, and we provided free legal services to indigent individuals and also to victims of domestic violence. And that was really when I dug into what I wanted to do. And I found that I really loved doing that work, and that work was what was rewarding. So I was offered a position with the National Center in DC to run our bar association, which I know we're going to talk a little bit more about. And within about 6 months, our previous executive director, who had been executive director for about 10 years, announced her resignation, and the board asked me to step in. And I've been in this role for about 5 years now. So that it has been a long, circular, somewhat path. I'm trying to get back into theater again, but it's been a long place, but it's been fun. And I like to say that it's been smartly spontaneous.
Excellent. That sounds perfect. Well, maybe we could start off talking a little bit about what exactly your center does. Like, who are you serving and what kinds of ways are you serving, I think victims of all kinds?
Absolutely. So we started out really from one family's pain. There's a very famous movie called A Reversal of Fortune. It features the story of Sonny von Bülow and Klaus von Bülow. This was the first kind of big true crime story in America. It was in the 1980s. Sonny was a beautiful, wealthy heiress. She had been married to Austrian royalty, and she was divorced. She had remarried this man, Klaus von Bülow, and he attempted to murder her twice. And the second time, he left her in a coma. And her children, Alla and Alex, were just so appalled by how they were treated by the justice system as victims. And they realized, and they had the foresight to realize, that if they, as a wealthy and powerful family who had the resources that they had the experience they had, how awful it must be for all other victims. And they were determined that would never happen again. So they took their inheritance and they founded our center. It was originally the Sonny von Bülow National Victim Advocacy Center. It is now the National Center for Victims of Crime. But so we really started out as an advocacy group to push forward the really important legislation that was not present at the time. So any type of victims' bills of rights, specific laws that surround violence against women, and the Victims of Crime Act, providing both monetary funds to crime victims, but also starting to establish what rights victims have in the criminal courts, because before they really didn't have any. Since 1985, which is when we were founded, we had so much success as an advocacy organization that we found most laws had been passed. And so we had to kind of figure out what we were going to do from there. And so we started to morph and really grow. And we've turned into an organization that does a lot of things. We provide direct services through 2 different hotlines. One is Victim Connect, and it's victimconnect.com. I encourage everybody to go there. It is completely a free service, and it serves any victim of crime. We can help with safety planning, with emotional support. It doesn't matter, again, what type of crime it is, what your demographics are, we're here to help. We also provide training and technical assistance to anybody who touches victims within the scope of the justice system. So police officers, victim advocates, attorneys, judges, if they are working with victims throughout the process, we are trying to get in front of them and train them. We also have a National Crime Victims Bar Association, which is specifically for attorneys who help victims in the civil sense. And then finally, we do some mass violence work. So we have a large fund that collects donations whenever there is an act of mass violence, pools them together, and then distributes them. 100% of the donations are distributed to victims of that mass violence event, both fairly and evenly. And we've got a little more work in the national mass violence space happening. We also have a few other conferences that are exciting coming up, but in general, that's what we do. And well, I try to make it less than a 5-minute spiel, but I think that was much more.
Renee, that's okay. I'm sure Emily has many questions, but my first one is, I think, to make what you just said a little more, I wouldn't say like accessible, but like understandable.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, could you give us, since Dear Katie is all about sexual violence survivors, could you talk about some of the maybe top 3 ways that you found you've been able to help and bring victims of sexual violence, support, and what you've done? Like maybe 3 ways or some examples or case studies.
Sure. I think the number one way is that Victim Connect hotline. What I didn't mention is that is completely confidential. And more importantly, it doesn't matter if you're working with law enforcement or not, or if you're cooperating. So a lot of times, if you are a victim of sexual assault, in order to have access to the victim advocates that either the police departments or the prosecutors offer, you have to continue to work with law enforcement. For us, we don't even ask your name. We keep it completely anonymous so that there is absolutely no pressure. And that's helpful to victims of sexual violence because oftentimes coming forward is terrifying. And if you come forward, there's the pressure to continue to work with people. We can work with you from the very beginning so you know what to expect and with absolutely no pressure applied. The other way that I think we really help victims of sexual violence is through our bar association. The sad fact of the world is that a lot of times, if you are a victim of sexual violence, there won't necessarily be justice within the criminal justice system. And that's for a multitude of reasons. But our bar association works with survivors to seek some measure of justice within the civil justice system and find resources to help them heal.
Emily, do you want to, I mean, you're listening in. I want our listeners to hear what your thoughts are. I mean, you're more or less meeting Renee for the first time. What are your next questions?
Yeah. I think that this is all like really cool and interesting work. I think that for me, a lot of my like conception of like what a lawyer does and what police do, especially when it comes to like sexual violence and the legal side of sexual violence, is shaped entirely around like a TV show like Law and Order SVU. So what would you say are like some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about what you do and what the police do and how I guess not only victims, but survivors can approach that with a little bit more understanding of what is actually happening?
So I think the biggest misconception is that a prosecutor represents a victim in any case, but especially in sexual justice cases. Prosecutors are wonderful. They do very hard work, but they do not represent victims. And so if a victim chooses to come forward and work with the police, first of all, police departments are stretched to their limits. They're underfunded and under-resourced. And so there's not always going to be a lot of hand-holding for the victim. And that can get very, very scary, especially as the justice process drags out. But more importantly, again, prosecutors don't represent victims. They represent the state. And so they don't have to consult with a victim on every single choice they make within the criminal process. They can choose what plea bargains to offer, and they don't necessarily have to get the victim's consent to offer that plea bargain. So it can be very scary for a victim to go through this process. However, I think that if you have a good victim advocate, and finding a good victim advocate is hugely crucial, and you don't usually see strong victim advocates in those TV shows because it's not quite as glamorous as a job, but it's just as important, if not more so.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that because I think that we often think of like, oh yeah, the prosecutor and like the police, they're the ones that are going to get you through that. But so you would say that it's important to know that there are these other resources that, you know, victims can access to support them through any sort of legal process.
Yes, absolutely.
And that was so great, Emily. Great question. And then Renee, here's a different one. You know, I dealt with Emily's exact question and what we've been talking about. The prosecutor, my DA in Virginia, said, I don't waste the taxpayers' dollars on cases like yours. His dad's a judge. He has millions of dollars. It's your word against his. There's no witnesses. That was the quote of my personal prosecutor DA. So what would a victim do if they heard that kind of response?
That is when I think if you can afford to. Now, that is the very unfortunate caveat. You get a private attorney. If you can't afford to, there are always appeals that could be made. You can always report, if it's a blatant ethics violation, you can report the prosecutor. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of mechanisms to fight something like that because prosecutors are usually given a great deal of leeway to make decisions like that. And it's very painful, but I think that's one of the places where we have to look at other ways of finding justice that is not within the justice system.
I love that part. That's where we're headed collectively too. Both of us, our foundations. And Emily has been with us for 4 years, an amazing volunteer and co-host on this podcast. So we're trying to come up with alternatives and still keep pushing education, because if we keep asking prosecutors to be more daring and more bold, even though, election, maybe we could talk about they're elected often. And one of the things they run on is their conviction record. And sexual violence is the worst one. Like, it's the lowest conviction rate. Maybe we could talk. And Renee, I had another idea, and Emily too. I think a special victims unit, since you referenced TV, Emily, one just recently came out where it was a sexual assault rape in a like a changing room, and the perpetrator was Black. And the victim said, I don't want to, essentially, I don't want to put another Black man in jail. So that's a big one to talk about too. Maybe we could talk about both. Emily, what are your thoughts on what I just said as my co-host? And then I'll toss it to Renee.
Yeah, I think a lot about these kinds of questions of people who very often choose not to come forward because they're concerned about getting the perpetrator in trouble. And very often when it comes to the legal system, it feels like you have to essentially go all the way or not do anything at all. And there is no sense of anything in between. Actually, I'm very curious, Renee, if if there are these sort of middle options where you may not, want to send somebody to prison for the rest of their lives, but at the same time still want some sort of acknowledgement that something has happened. Are there any other legal options?
So there are a couple. The first would be the civil justice access. So in the story of being assaulted in a dressing room or in a locker room, you would be able to, in a civil justice case, file charges against, I'm assuming it was a gym or the store, wherever it was, if they knew that employee was dangerous and if they did not have proper security, or if they failed to do a background check and allowed him to be exposed. So that's where civil justice kicks in. There's also an idea, and it's called restorative justice, and it is taking the nation by storm. And you hear it a lot as a catchphrase, but it's a very specific type of process that certain counties employ, other counties don't, and it's county by county. But what happens is the victim and the individual who caused the harm agree that they are going to meet, and they're going to go through a mediation process with a mediator. And there will be some sort of accountability, but usually it takes out any type of incarceration. And the individual who committed the crime has to agree that they did commit the crime. So they do have to admit that. And sometimes that's all you need. In cases like sexual assault, that's a huge ask, right? You don't always necessarily want to put the victim in the room with their perpetrator. But if the victim is willing and they don't want to pursue something further, that is an option.
Hey, Renee, let's talk about, you're so good. I feel like you could give a speech in a second. Listen, I was thinking maybe we could parse it out a little better, because I'm just starting to realize everything you say, we need to unpack it for our listeners, because I'm not saying they don't know, but I'm saying so the next thing I heard you say, and Emily, I think this will be helpful if we can do this better. Renee, you're amazing.
Slow me down, stop me, tell me to, I try to give sound clips, I feel and then I realize I'm going too fast.
No, you're fine. You're just going over so much information. And I feel like we just have to go from I feel like we're in the C4S Porsche 911 in gear 6. And we just need to slow down the carbon fiber wheel rims just a little bit.
Yep, no, that is fine.
Yeah, no worries. So let's go back to a couple points. One is, Emily asked, are there middle grounds? And then you talked about I'm just recapping a few things. Restorative practices, restorative justice. I think we went over that term a little too quickly. And then we talked a little bit about being in the same room as one's offender, alleged offender, perpetrator, etc. So maybe we first digest, what does it mean to say, I want restorative justice or practice? And then we can talk about it, how to navigate being in the same room. And is that always necessary? Because one of the things I did was teach institutions, you could put up a curtain, you could do a live webcam in separate rooms, and lots of options to not sit directly across from your perpetrator. And for our listeners, since you get to know me a lot through the podcast, when I had my hearing at my college, it was not restorative, but he brought 2 lawyers. They sat wing to wing, and my perpetrator kicked me across the 3.5 foot or 3 foot table at least twice. He was very tall. So I got kicked by my perpetrator, plus he brought 2 lawyers, and it was not very restorative at all. But I'm sure if you keep following the podcast, you'll hear more about that story. So going back, first, Renee, what's restorative justice and practice? And then we'll get to being in the same room. Emily, does that sound good to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually very interested in like how restorative justice is practiced, because I think that really is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but at the same time, like how it is actually implemented, especially with the current legal system.
Perfect.
I've never heard anything.
So Emily, do you mind I'm sorry, Emily, that was great. Renee, can you talk about it?
Yeah. And I'm going to say, let's start even a step below that and unpack it even a step further to give a little bit more of a baseline with the idea. And a lot of people aren't going to like hearing this, but it is what it is. The criminal justice system itself is not focused on victims. It is not focused on being victim-centered. It is not focused on being trauma-informed. It is not about victims at all. The goal of prosecutions is not to make victims whole. It is not to help to restore the victim's dignity. It is to protect society and to punish. Those are 2 of the stated goals. And then incarceration is meant to rehabilitate and punish. But the system we have set up, well, frankly, it's not working for anybody, but it definitely doesn't work for victims. So the idea of restorative justice is taking our concept of what would bring justice and saying, what if we looked at this not as a way to punish somebody, but as a way to restore or help fix the harm that was caused by this conflict or crime? So does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think, especially with what you mentioned, that like, I think right now, criminal justice is very much focused on punishment. Like, how does that actually get implemented?
Right. And so if you have a county that is willing to, and again, it's a county by county basis, it depends on what your jurisdiction does. But if they are willing to set up a program that allows this as an option, what happens is you have the perpetrator admit that they have done the harm. And they admit that without the threat of jail time, but they admit that while taking full accountability of the harm. And you have the victim who is acknowledging that this person going to prison isn't necessarily going to make me whole. And it's not going to heal whatever was done. So working with both individuals to look at rehabilitation, to look at other options besides incarceration, what could work. And it becomes a mediation and a negotiation.
Interesting.
Yeah, absolutely, Renee. How about one like concrete example? Can you, if you know of a case that sounds accessible to our listeners, like what's a positive resolution that you can think of that would give them a better sense of what's possible?
I can't ethically give
Oh,
specifics.
like an example, like a hypothetical kind of based on what's realistic.
I can say that most victims need the other person to acknowledge that they have done harm and that they have hurt that person, and they need that other person to hear the way it hurt them. And this often gives them that opportunity.
That makes total sense. And it's mostly kind of a hearing and the voice of your perpetrator saying, I acknowledge, and it might not be an apology. Is there a differentiation in your mind between acknowledgement and apology?
I've never thought of it that way.
Mm.
A large part of where we see most victims really what most victims really care about more is the level of accountability. And so the acknowledging, I
Mm.
don't know if victims would view an acknowledgement different than an apology,
I
like
think
full
I think
accountability.
I love that. I mean, this is like a cool conversation to me, Renee and Emily. I think, you know, I'm for our listeners, if you don't know so much, just imagine most of my life starting around 18, even in college. This is what my life looked like for 3 decades. No, I will say at least 2 decades. I would go and give a speech even while I was in college, and I was couldn't afford a rental car. I was too young to drive a rental car. And so I would just be brought in by a college and then stay. Usually the RA or RD would give up their dorm room. And I would luxuriate in their bath salts and or like shampoo. I was like, wow. But some of my funnest moments were like, I just told the story of my worst night, and then there were 1,000 people there, and now I go back to this RD's room, and wow, they have cool shower gel. I was pretty simple. That was the highlight. And then I would dare say from 10 p.m. when I got back until some nights 1:30 to 3 in the morning, survivors would come in and knock on the door and say, "Can I talk to you?" And I never turned one down. And I kept a journal, Renee and Emily and listeners. I would challenge myself because I usually had to get up at 6 the next morning, get on a plane because the dean would drive me back to the airport. And on the plane, I would half nap but half write and recite in my head what I learned. And so back to where we started, which is, what does a survivor want
Mhm.
from this idea of, and I'll blend it together, Renee and Emily and listeners, like we're talking about justice, but we're also like, I think it's nuanced to healing, nuanced to an apology, nuanced to like resolution, nuanced to like, how can I make sure I'm not hurt again and other people aren't hurt again? It's all the essential questions for a victim of any crime, Renee, to your point. Like, how can I make sure that I'm healed and others don't hurt?
And
And yeah, go ahead.
in restorative justice, when it's done correctly, it's so much more than just the offender apologizing. The victim can ask for them to take anger management classes, and that is
Ooh.
part of the contract. I mean, you come out with a contract of things they will do. The victim can ask for reparation, for medical bills to be paid.
Oh, that's
There's a
perfect.
lot that can be put into this contract that is all of the things that the victim wants to see in order to both feel safe and feel that the community is safe.
I love that. So just, to recap, Renee, does every institution, how does one, if our listeners like, wow, that's exactly what I want. what would be the first step to access that process?
You would talk to your district attorney's office.
Mm-hmm.
They would be the ones that would know. And I'm not going to lie, sometimes district attorneys may have a restorative justice program, but they can also decide that they do not want a certain offender to go through that restorative justice program because they don't think that they would be successful. But the first step would be talking to the district attorney.
And when you say won't be successful, what does that mean? That it will not be successful for whom?
For anybody.
Okay.
Anybody. If a person is if it was a very violent crime, random crimes, if they are repeat offenders, there could be a decision that this person is just not eligible, because restorative justice in sense is a grace.
Gotcha. Okay. Emily, that was a huge conversation around one topic, Renee. Emily, can you think of anything our listeners might have wanted to know and we didn't ask yet of Renee?
I don't have any questions that come up to mind. I do remember, so I took a women and gender studies course in college that was specifically about like the current like methods that people use to challenge sexual violence and what the institutional like structures are that protect people from sexual violence and like the resources that people can access. And I remember one of the most controversial class discussions that we had was specifically about restorative justice. And we were shown this video that was about the sort of therapy for people who commit these crimes, in an effort to, make sure that they don't commit them again, that like, that approach in contrast to punishment and incarceration, or even alongside those kinds of punishment, that approach was so controversial among the students. A lot of people were very, very concerned that this was giving them a break, that this was something that the perpetrators weren't owed, or for some reason something that they didn't deserve. And so have you encountered anyone who's sort of had that perspective, that like the only way to fix this is punishment, and as severe punishment as possible, and the only way to make sure that this never happens again is only through punishment?
I'm sure there are people out there. I'm sure I've encountered them. My counterpoint to them is, first of all, we're proving again and again and again that punishment, the way we do it in the States, doesn't work, period. We're not rehabilitating well. And so unless somebody's going to be incarcerated for the rest of their lives, punishment isn't a guarantee of safety. And we're not going to lock people away for the rest of their lives, absent a homicide, frankly. But we know punishment doesn't work. Incarceration as we do it does not make society safer. It doesn't. But my second point to that would be restorative justice. The victim has to agree to participate in that. And so if somebody was saying, in a classroom or trying to have a policy debate with me, I would say that I believe that every victim who has already lost their autonomy, lost their right to make choices, has the right to choose if this is right for them. And somebody trying to have a policy debate shouldn't be allowed to take away that choice for a victim if that is the process that they believe is best for them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that very often survivor voices in particular tend to be drowned out in these like very like theoretical policy discussions, that we forget that these are like very real people going through this. And I think as a like segue into the second topic that Katie mentioned, this like having to be in the same room as the perpetrator, and having to be in the same room as the person who did all of this. Like, is there a movement to sort of change the way that we, approach this kind of litigation, or support people who are going, like, essentially being re-traumatized by the justice system? And what are the ways that, like, people who are going through this process can advocate for themselves and find people to advocate for them.
So we are trying, as the Bar Association and as NCVC, to bring an idea of trauma-informed lawyering into the defense world. Well, actually, trauma-informed lawyering into all of the attorneys, because a prosecutor or a plaintiff's attorney can do just as much damage if they don't know how to speak to their client and how to respect boundaries and spaces that the client's in. So we are trying to bring trauma-informed lawyering. Unfortunately, as far as being in the same room, et cetera, that's again going to be different from each jurisdiction. A lot of jurisdictions will allow individuals to testify via video so that they are not in the same room, but there are a lot of defense attorneys that get very angry when you talk about that as an option, because they say that their client has an absolute right to confront their accuser per the Constitution. And the way they read the Constitution means their client has a right to stare at their accuser. It's a battle that I'm sure will go on for a long time. I will tell you, I've presented on this idea of trauma-informed lawyering to a group of defense lawyers, and it did not go well. And that was their reaction, was that I was trying to strip their clients' rights of confronting their accuser. So
Renee, can you explain that more? That was so interesting. What were some of the lines they used against you?
They were exactly that. They were, why would you take away our clients have a constitutional right to stare at their accuser. They have a constitutional right to face their accuser. And so they have to be allowed to be in the same room. That was their entire line. It wasn't any more artistically done than that.
That's so interesting. And how do you think you fared against them with your retaliation comments? Retorts. I won't say retaliation. I'll say retorts.
I mean, under my breath, I called them horrible human beings.
All right.
But I joking aside, I respect the work of defense attorneys and what they need to do. And I certainly want them in our society for a multitude of reasons. However, my retort to them was more, I am trying to teach you how to be a trauma-informed lawyer so that you have the best trial possible. Because what you need to know is that when you are asking a victim questions on the stand and you are doing so in an untrauma-informed way, you are not going to get the best answers out of that victim. You're not. And you're going to look like a horrible human being to the jury. It has become very not favorable to most juries to see the kind of 1980s defense lawyer taking down a victim of sexual violence in a brutal cross-examination. Juries don't accept that anymore. So there is a benefit to being trauma-informed for these defense attorneys. But the other thing I tell them, which sometimes does get their attention, is if they are representing clients who've committed violent acts, oftentimes those clients have trauma in their background themselves. We know that a large percentage of individuals who are incarcerated were victims of crime and were victims of trauma at some point, and they did not get the services they needed. And so it would really benefit them to also be trauma-informed when interacting with their own clients. That sometimes gets them a little bit more.
Gotcha.
That's so interesting, actually, that like, I think that reaction is understandable, that they're like, oh, I want to make sure that my client gets the best, possible defense. But at the same time, I think that the counter argument there, which is that I don't know that it looks great for you to bully a victim on the stand. I don't know that is actually a helpful way to go about this. I think that's really interesting and of course an effective argument in this circumstance.
We have an ethical obligation as attorneys. We all say that we have, it's usually canon number 1 in most states' rules of ethics. We have an absolute ethical duty to zealously represent our clients to the absolute best of our ability. And I get that, and I'm glad it's there. But I think that sometimes there are interesting ways to put the idea in people's mind that there are other ways to zealously advocate for their clients that might be slightly better.
Yeah, absolutely. Like this doesn't have to involve you being really like aggressive and mean towards the other side, especially because I mean, at the end of the day, our theoretically the goal of justice is to make sure that, that people get punished for the crimes that they do and that everyone gets, representation and support, and that the outcome is amenable to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's really cool that we were able to actually discuss like all of these different forms of justice too, because I think that again, if you're like Law and Order SVU, that's the kind of thing that you're used to. Like you don't even think of all of the different ways that, justice might actually play out.
And there are times out that you have to go outside of the formal justice system of the United States. And I've seen a lot of creative ways that is done. And as long as it gives victims the sense of peace, then I think it's wonderful. And that they're not doing anything illegal, of course. But you have to look at alternate means because the justice system just is not an end all be all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, one of the things that a lot of our guests have discussed is that even if they end up pursuing legal action and even if they win, that healing doesn't always come from that legal outcome, but really from, the support and the community and the love and like that sort of very individual journey as opposed to using or being a part of this broader system. So actually, since you mentioned these sort of alternate ways of pursuing justice, can you like describe any of them? Like what are the possible approaches here?
Sure. Well, I will actually encourage your listeners to look up a phenomenal woman named Anne Oliverius. Emily or Katie, you might have come in contact with her. I'm not sure.
Not yet.
And so meet her. Anne is just an absolute dynamo. She was also date raped and is very open about her date rape. So I'm not sharing anything I'm not supposed to, but she was date raped at Yale and in the 70s, I want to say, but before date rape was a term that was used. And Anne's become a lawyer since. She actually practices in the UK now. But she was so upset she could not get any support from Yale or from Princeton because there was I can't remember the full story, but there was a follow-up at Princeton. And she got absolutely no support. And so years later, she looked up the man who had date raped her and realized he was a doctor. Specifically focusing in geriatrics, and she became very worried about his patients. And so she started to write to the medical board. And the medical board wouldn't do anything. She filed an ethics complaint against him. And when that did not work, she set up a website. And I'm trying to remember the website's name, but it was basically she told her whole story. She named her perpetrator. She said exactly what happened. And then she opened it up for other women to come forward and start to discuss what had happened to them. And they found a lot of healing. And I will tell you, she has a website and it's AnneOliverius.com. And you can find all of her work on that. But that was one way was she set up a method for other women to share their stories while sharing hers.
Oh, wow. That is amazing, Renee. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm thinking what else our listeners would love to learn from you, Renee. You're such a wealth of information. Emily, can you think about what we've had questions about or what else that Renee could offer?
Yeah, I actually do have, this is more of like almost the other way around. I think that often people who either make accusations or are attempting to pursue justice, they often face backlash, especially if, the justice system ends up deciding that the person, the perpetrator is not guilty. And so what resources are there for people who go through this entire process and at the end of the day, it doesn't work out for them? And are there sort of legal opportunities to sort of, pursue things further? And are there other sorts of support networks for people who feel like justice really wasn't served?
There is always, again, the civil option, because, so I'll unpack this because this is a very strange and technical area of the law. In criminal cases, and Emily, you'll know this because you like the Law and Orders, they say that the burden of proof, we talk about well, Emily, tell us, what's the burden of proof in the criminal justice system? You know what it is.
Well, yeah, I guess we assume innocent until proven guilty. So the burden of proof is on the person making the accusation.
And it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Importantly, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. And the way one of my professors defined that in law school was a feather could touch the scale. And if that feather touches the scale, you really just have to convince one jury member that this maybe isn't the way things happened, and you get a not guilty verdict. In the civil justice system, it's a little different. First of all, there's no presumption of guilt either way. So you don't hear they're innocent until proven guilty. You're just looking at the cases. But more importantly, that burden of proof is much lighter, and it's more likely than not. And that usually makes all the difference. So sometimes you can have a civil case that is more successful than a criminal case. And the most famous case that everybody's going to know, boom, off the top of their heads, is the O.J. Simpson case. Right? So there wasn't beyond reasonable doubt in his criminal case, but the jury in the civil case was like, yeah, this was probably what happened. So there is civil court as an option. After civil court, there is not, but there are lots of survivor groups. I know, again, and this is not a shameless plug because, again, it's free, but Victim Connect, if you start by calling us, or you can chat or text with us, they can connect you to all sorts of resources wherever you are.
That's a fantastic resource for our listeners to know about. I think I want to touch on a little bit. I think sometimes when people, go public with a story, there is this concern that they could be sued for lying. Is that a thing that does happen? Are there ways that we can protect ourselves from sort of legal consequences being brought on us if we say that something happened and someone says, no, you're lying and I'm going to sue you for it?
There are protections. Every state has what's called an anti-SLAPP law. And so that means that if you bring a case to sue somebody, a defendant can't threaten you and say, I'm going to sue you for defamation because you brought this case. So there are anti-SLAPP laws in every state. Usually they work, but they are heavily litigated because there's always a question of what is defamation and what was truthful. But I will say we've seen a decline in defamation cases because of these anti-SLAPP laws.
That's really, really interesting because I think that that's something that people often discuss. I've discussed this with some other survivors, that sometimes they're really afraid of, publicly saying, like, somebody did this thing to me, especially if there isn't a legal option to even warn other people that, there's this person who's doing these things, that they're concerned about, the potential for legal action. And so I think it's really reassuring that this is not something that someone can just, I guess, slap on you to prevent you from saying something that is true.
Right. And I think it's important to know that, of course, the defendant is going to threaten this. Of course they are. But they're doing so without any legal backing, usually of any type. Right. So, of course, they're going to send you the letter before they have an attorney that says, if you tell somebody this, I'm going to sue you. But they don't have a legal degree to be able to say that they're going to do that. And most of the time they can't.
Yeah, I guess it really is just whatever I can say to make this not happen. I'm gonna make these threats. I'm gonna say these things, even if there is no basis.
Yeah, but look, and it's terrifying in the moment.
Hmm.
I was a 19-year-old survivor, and all of it was terrifying because you don't know. But that's also why I do these interviews, so people can learn. And so if somebody out there hears that maybe they get a little bit of courage.
Yeah, absolutely. Like knowledge is power. And of course, there's so many resources out there. And everybody is, I think, really the narrative around sexual violence and like even the concept of false accusations and the uh, it's really great actually that the Me Too movement has kind of shifted so such that we really do believe survivors a little bit more than we used to. Of course, that doesn't always translate to better litigation. It doesn't translate to more justice, but there's so much more information out there, which I think is really, really helpful. Um, Katie, I'm not sure if we want to like start heading toward the finish line,
I
how we
know
want to wrap
we
up
could
here.
obviously talk with you for forever, Renee. I think let's just summarize kind of the themes that we talked about for our listeners. Clearly we've talked about there are important considerations for justice. A district attorney or prosecutor is a first stop, but not an end stop. And asking about other options beyond, a criminal justice standard, beyond a reasonable doubt kind of outcome with restorative practices could be a great option. It's not always available, but one can request it. And I also think we haven't really talked to Emily about our own Take Back the Night hotline. Maybe you could do that next. And I'm not sure what else you want to add, Renee, but I would love, Emily, you to explain how our hotline works and where those calls and intake forms go. But Renee, anything else you want to add? I know down the road, you and I are going to work on perhaps some training for attorneys, and maybe we also need those DAs to come to the table to learn about trauma-informed and empower them to take on cases they might not win, but would really serve the victim's mindset in terms of, not that apology, but that step toward healing. Emily, do you want to go back to anything else and at least explain our hotline at Take Back the Night?
Yes, so Take Back the Night Foundation has a hotline as well as an online forum if you're not comfortable with calling. That number is 567 Shatter. That at that number you can find support for US based cases. You will receive completely free information about your legal options. And we have an incredible team of lawyers around the country that will support you, that will tell you what your options are, and help you through the process. So again, this is 100% free. If you are interested, you can go to the Take Back the Night Foundation website to find out more information. But that number, again, is 567 Shatter for all of our listeners. This is an excellent free resource to take advantage of if you would like. And of course, Renee is one of the lovely people who has helped us with getting that off the ground and worked with us closely, along with an incredible team of other lawyers. So thank you to everyone involved, and thank you to our volunteers for helping make that happen. But this is a resource that's available to all of our listeners, anyone in the US who wants to use it. It's a great, great thing to take advantage of.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Emily. And Renee, anything else you want to add for our listeners in our episode today?
I would just say that being the victim of sexual violence is terrifying and you lose your control for a moment. But when you take back your control, you can start to feel better. And it is a scary process, but it is very worth it in the end. And you should not feel ashamed. And you should be proud for being a survivor and making it where you make it.
That is perfect, Renee. Thank you so much. And, as we close out this episode, please, survivors, I know we did a lot of technical stuff today, but it's all important. And if this is where you are in your journey and you're ready to seek justice, you might as well fill out, our hotline, call 567 Shatter or the form, and our trauma-informed team will definitely give you some great help. It will not be, unfortunately, Renee directly you will be speaking with, but Renee is, one of our really well-informed colleagues and treasured, I would say, colleagues in this space. So you've met another great human out there trying to change the world. So for our survivors, our listeners, our supporters, we encourage you to continue the healing journey. Remember that you are not alone, and we encourage you to tune into another episode. Thank you so much. Thank you again, everybody, for joining another episode of the Dear Katie podcast. I hope very much you found today's episode helpful, empowering, and a way to take another step in that long journey toward healing and supporting those we care about, learning about sexual violence prevention, and also survivor support. For those of you who don't know, again, the Take Back the Night website has tons of great resources, books, self-care options, cool merch. If you're feeling like you need a wearable, we have great t-shirts. Of course, we would love it if you follow along on our free newsletter with news and events going on around the country and even around the globe. And finally, don't forget to like us and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. You'll find our entire community popping up here and there, and recaps of our podcast episodes as well. So together we shatter the silence, and together we end the violence. Take care.